Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, a very warm welcome to our distinguished guests from the US, mainly from California, and firstly also apologize for not being able to deliver what you are used to have, the sun. I mean, it's a pretty mild day today, but not as sunny as in the Golden State. So I highly appreciate that nevertheless you made the way to the dark German situation. Everyone else, a very warm welcome from my side. My name is Christian Hochfeld. For those who don't know me, I'm the director of Agora Verkehrswende, and I'm very happy today to welcome you to DE.CA.rbonize Transportation, the German Californian conference for zero-emission transportation. And when you read through the news today, and we will maybe later come back on this issue, you also see that there's a long way from today's perspective to a decarbonized transport world. And this is why I think what is really needed is also the international cooperation, the exchange with those countries and states which are also following a very ambitious pathway to work on climate-friendly transport. And that's why I'm very happy that today we have the honor and the pleasure to jointly discuss those issues and these questions with our colleagues and friends from California about the decarbonization pathway of the transportation sector. Maybe, first of all, a couple of words to the building. This is, for those of you who are not from Berlin, the former State Council building, which already observed a couple of revolutions in Germany. The old facade includes the balcony where the first democratic republic in Germany has been announced in 1918. Then the shape of this building as you see it today was because this building served as a state council building during the German Democratic Republic. So here was the office of the government of the German Democratic Republic, which the word democratic maybe you have to put in brackets here. But it was also, after the wall came down, the seat and the office of our Chancellor before we got the new Chancellor's office. So a couple of revolutions with regard to system and systematic change and transformation has been already seen in this building. Now it's the European School for Management and Technology. But hopefully we can discuss about a couple of other revolutions today about transforming our transport system. But we also have to take care that not the old piece will be the, let's say, image of what we call the climate-friendly transport system, and that also the ambition in climate change and climate protection in the transport sector should not only be a facade or a Potemkin village. Where we are at the moment, and this is a street sign in Berlin, is that the Diesel Street seems to be a dead end with damaged paveway. And in this regard, even if you read through the news today, you see that we did not make the breakthrough from this dead-end Diesel Street to a decarbonized technology, to a climate-friendly vehicle technology and fuel technology system, and we neither made it working on a climate-friendly transport system, so not only focusing on the energy transition in transport, but also on the transport transformation and the mobility transition, and we will come back to it. I think something we don't keep in mind very oftenly when we talk about the question, why are we doing this? Why are we trying to transform the whole transport system worldwide? Is that the transport system, and not only the transport system, but also the transport system won't work properly in a world of climate change. So if we were not, and if we are not successful in transforming the transport system in a climate-friendly, in a climate-neutral way, we won't be able to, also take our mobility behavior serious and move around as we did it or as we are used to. And I mean, this is something we experience here in Germany, but this is also what has been already experienced in California in the last years and last months and last weeks, that we see more and more events, climate change related, the dramatic weather events, which will also affect the proper transport system. And just as a short anecdote, I think my proposal would be to end the situation that we in Germany name storms or giving them the first names in alphabetic order, because the last storm here in Berlin had the name of my wife, which is Friederike. And when you hear the whole day, you should take care of Friederike and beware of this, that could seriously influence the relationship of people. So that is just a short remark with regard to transforming our transport system. If we see that the transport emissions are constantly rising over the last decades, we see that there is a high, also need for making a real turnaround happen. And even if the growth of the sector's emissions are higher in the developing countries and the emerging economies, still the lion's share of the energy consumption and the transport-related greenhouse gas emissions are related to the G20 countries, and that's where the biggest responsibility is in doing this turnaround and coming up with climate-friendly solutions. We see that there is a huge difference. We don't have a big increase in the developed world. We see here, we haven't distinguished between the US and California. We should do so. I apologize for this. But we see that we don't have a huge increase in those states, but we see, and the size of the bullet is representing the absolute emissions, that there is a high emission related to our mobility behavior and the way we move freight and goods around in these countries, which have to make the first step in changing this and coming up with a low-carbon transport system. And when we look at this on the global scale, we see that if we are continuing doing this in the business as usual case, we will end up with a steep increase of the temperature until the end of the century, which would definitely be not in line with keeping the temperature rise until the end of the century limited to 2 degrees. That would mean that we are, or that we need to really reduce the CO2 emissions from transport dramatically until the mid of this century, nearly being carbon neutral. But this is something we also have to discuss. It's pretty clear that transforming the transport sector is crucial for the whole and the overarching clean energy transition, but also for reaching the climate goals, especially keeping the temperature rise below and well below 2 degrees until the end of the century. If we look at the German situation, just for at least for our Californian guests, we were not able to decrease the absolute emissions over the last 25 years. And this is the only sector, the transport sector, where we are not able to have a reduction in absolute terms. There is a reduction with regard to passenger transport. We were able to reduce the emissions by, let's say, 10–15%. I think this is pretty much in line with California, where we see over the last, let's say, 10–15 years, a decline of 5 to 10% in transport overall. But the emissions from the freight sector, they were responsible that we are still having, or we are still at the same amount of emissions in Germany since 1990, around 160 million tons. In the last 2 or 3 years, especially due to decline in the fuel prices, we see an even growing number of emissions compared to 1990, and we expect that 2017 will be slightly above the 1990 level in addition. That's why we have now targets in transport with regard to the Climate Protection Plan 2050 issued by the German government at the end of 2016. We were pretty clear that the transport sector has to reduce the emissions, and that for the first time ever we have sector-specific targets for the transport sector until 2030 to come up with an emission reduction by 40 to 42% compared to 1990 until 2030. Given the fact that we have no absolute emission reductions since then, that means we have now the very ambitious but necessary target to reduce the emissions by 40% over the next 15 years, which put a lot of stress on policies, technologies, and also behavior. And that's what we have to achieve, this 40% in transport. It's a little bit, I wouldn't say totally in line, but comparable to the existing goals in California. California doesn't have up to now sector-specific goals for each of the sectors, but the overarching goal for the whole economy is also to reduce 40% of CO2 emission reductions until 2030 compared to to the 2000 level, which is then a little bit more than we have since 1990. So we are at the same level, and that's what makes it interesting for us to see how can we work together, how can we cooperate to make this happen, as we see that there is also a huge ambition, a very stable ambition, and California is one of the few states and countries which is very ambitious and stably ambitious to work on climate change and to stay on the pathway for a climate-friendly economy. This is just an outtake of a paper which we haven't published yet. I won't stress it too much, but I just want to show one thing. We analyzed the potential contribution of the existing proposal by the European Commission on the CO2 car regulation for light-duty vehicles beyond 2020 to, what is the contribution of this regulation if you just isolate this regulation to what we have to achieve until 2030 emission reduction. And we see that the current scenario and the Commission proposal is reducing the emissions at least better than the business as usual scenario, but to 142, 143 million tons in 2030. Given the fact that we have to reduce the whole transport sector, including freight, on a level around 95, 98 million tons, that shows, on the one hand, first question, is this regulation ambitious enough? for us to reach our climate targets. Secondly, it's pretty clear, even if this will be very ambitious, we have to add a lot of other measures. So there will be no silver bullet for reaching the climate targets in 2030. It will be very much a mix from European regulation on European standards, not only on light-duty vehicles, but also on heavy-duty vehicles and fuels, but also with a lot of measures and high ambition level if we would like to meet the target on the national level. And that's why I think it's a second thing we would love to discuss with our colleagues from California, because they have a very comprehensive climate regulation in place, not only regulating technologies, vehicle technologies, but also taking care of other sectors, taking care of communities. So at the end, we need a very proper policy package to reach these goals. And the question is, what is this policy package looking like? A comprehensive strategy to reach the climate goals, not only focusing on single issues. And it's pretty clear that this is not only possible by moving the technologies forward, but also to, on the one hand, concentrate on the energy transition in transport, making the vehicle and fuels more efficient, and turning to electrification as part of the efficiency transition. That is part of the story, to replace the fossil fuels and the fossil oil and gas in the sector by renewables, but it will not be enough to reach the climate targets if we are not able to reduce the energy demand and the way we move forward to make the system more efficient, to combine the transport in a more efficient way, to combine the public transport system together with new mobility services, and come up with a more efficient transport system at all. And this is another story why it's, I think, a great opportunity to discuss and to have the dialogue with California and also cooperate with you, that this mobility transition is part of the story of transforming the urban transport system. And in some of the cities, it has already been done, and it's already starting, also due to the fact that, it's not in Germany, but in other parts of the world, the urbanization is much faster than it is here. And with this huge urbanization process, here we see the same picture of Shanghai Pudong, 1985, and in 2010, 25 years only in between the same picture. That this puts a lot of pressure also on the urban transport system, and where the problems are higher with using the space, less ambient air quality, higher energy use, and also higher CO2 emissions at the end, you will have also a higher pressure on innovating the transport system to make it more reliable and to come up with a solution which fits to the needs of the cities. This I already, or some of you may already know this from former presentations, is a picture out of my Beijing office when I ask myself if it's a good time to go home. Normally at this stage it was not the best time to go home, but it shows that it's not only about, especially in urban areas, about climate issues. It's more about reducing the land consumption, improving air quality, reducing congestion, improving road safety, reducing noise, and securing the energy supply, which drives the urban transport system. In Germany, and this is a little bit a difference to the Californian situation, we are very much taking care in urban areas of our public transport system. We developed this transit system in most of our cities quite well. We see this as the backbone of urban transport, but we also see that now with the new mobility services in place coming up, that we, on the one hand, have the opportunity to reduce the dependency on privately owned cars, to come up with a combination of public transport and the new mobility services. So private transport becomes more public with car and ride sharing and ride pooling, but public transport becomes also more private. That gives us the opportunity for fewer cars, leaving more space for other land use, also for other transport modes like cycling, and ending up potentially in a more sustainable urban transport system which receives more political support. But this will not come by itself. It needs a lot of regulatory but also political framework to develop this situation and to come up with a good situation as those technologies are arriving, but the regulations and the idea of how to get also the social and the environmental benefits out of this system are not in place yet. We are seeing that there might be the chance for what we call a mobility alliance, including public transport, the non-motorized transport, and the collaborative modes in the urban area. And we see that, if you ask the question, what would Jesus drive? That was a question run by the Sierra Club a couple of years ago on the question, what car technology you use. It seems that Jesus would be preferably using the shared modes already. Here is the interface of the smartphone for Uber saying Jesus is arriving now in a Honda Accord, which means he also decided on a brand. But honestly speaking, and we have this brand already today represented in our office, honestly speaking, that is a big question of how we derive the environmental benefits from these collaborative modes, and we definitely will go into depth discussing this. But on the other hand, we also see that these sharing modes also are not limited only to motorized transport systems, but introduced mainly by the Chinese or by Chinese companies backed by the Chinese IT giants. We see that the bike is coming back to the kingdom of cars, the new kingdom of cars, China, with the new bike sharing schemes on the one hand, which offers a huge opportunity again to interlink the transport modes, but also increase the share of non-motorized transport modes. In Beijing only, over the last 1.5 years, the bike mode, the cycling mode increased from 5%, where it ended after 20 years from 2/3 at 5%. Now we have again a steep increase to 10% of biking modes. That this system also has to be introduced and included and integrated in a broader scheme is also shown by maybe some of the downsides of the system change and the downsides of this added system without the integration, but it only shows that there is a room for improvement. We see driverless cars will arrive, and this is mainly driven by, on the one hand, companies in California, also here in Germany, and also in potentially the south of China. And we see that this may have also potentially very good impacts and benefits to our transport system by reducing fuel consumption, space, vehicle stock, and so on. But on the other hand, we also see that if we use those cars in the future in the private ownership mode, that could also end up with higher mileage, higher vehicle ownership, higher space consumptions, and higher emissions. So at the end, it's a question of how to do this. The technologies, they will develop. I mean, there's huge investment in those technologies. The question is, what would be an answer to, on the one hand, using these technologies also to reduce CO2 emissions and coming up with a more proper transport system in urban areas. And this will be our second issue and our second core theme today in the discussions we have after the overall strategies, that we focus on the transformation of the urban transport system, including also the new technologies like autonomous vehicles. I'm not at the end, but at the second pillar of the discussion, which we will lead over the next 1.5 days. It's the question on, if we talk about the mobility transition on the one hand, we also have to talk about the question what kind of new technologies are on the vehicle side. And definitely from a today perspective, it looks like that electrification is potentially the key for the energy transition in transport, as we have, let's say, at least 4 options to a post-fossil future of transport. We have, if we use still the internal combustion engine, the option to use liquid or gaseous fuels, biofuels. We have the option, which is mainly discussed in Germany, and we are very eager to discuss this also with our colleagues and friends from California, power-generated fuels, power to liquid, power to gas, to see if this is an appropriate option for some of the transport modes. And if we change the propulsion system, we have the options of battery electric cars, including plug-in hybrids and range extender, or we have fuel cell vehicles running on hydrogen. From a German perspective, we have different overall costs of changing the systems, and definitely all the options for the decarbonized world are related to increased costs, but there is definitely a difference in the overall cost, which you can see on the right side in the columns between all the systems, showing that from a today's perspective, the direct electrification in at least the private transport and private car mode is the most not energy efficient only, but also cost efficient solution. Against this background, we see not only driven by energy and climate issues, but also by the issue of the consequences of Dieselgate and the increased need for ambient air quality, that a lot of countries, or some of the countries in Europe, but also in Asia, are working in the direction of phasing out at least diesel, but also internal combustion engines over the next decades, which is a very long way to go when we look at the numbers today, where we see that from the more than 80 million light-duty vehicles which are annually sold today, we are having only about 1 million electric vehicles, 800,000 to 1 million electric vehicles in 2017 already. So it's around 1%. And this is also, showing that we are happy and eager to discuss with California how to improve and increase the share of electric vehicles over the next years, as you already achieved the amount of 5% in the new sales and new cars sold fleet compared to Germany, as we are still struggling with 0.5% in the new sales or annually sales new fleet. This was very difficult for me. I don't know why. Well, an indication also on where to focus on shows that currently we are talking about that 40% of all EV sales worldwide are focusing or are based in 20 cities worldwide. There is no German city among these 20 cities, but at least 3 cities in California, San Francisco, San Jose, and Los Angeles, with a very high share of those EV sales worldwide compared to other regions in the world. And this transformation, which has to be done, is even more ambitious in the next years, as we see that we have to do this transition from combustion engine cars to electric vehicles in a time where we see worldwide the trend for falling fuel prices, and we don't see the high or the other way around a trend with regard to higher fuel prices. At this point, we can say that there is battery electric vehicles, including plug-in hybrids and range extender, a benchmark for light duties, for buses and potentially rail. We have a big question on the question, what is the preferential technology option for heavy duty on the roadmap and on the pathway for decarbonizing also heavy duty freight, especially long-haul trucks. And I'm very happy that this is then the fourth part, including e-mobility, that we are also talking tomorrow about the question of how to decarbonize truck options and see if we can come up with joint ideas or harmonized solutions in this field, which would be beneficial to the climate, but also beneficial to the industry, as we are talking about short numbers in sales, and definitely the costs would be reduced if we have at least regional, but also globally harmonized solutions. Last point, again on this question, what is the role of fuels and carbon neutral fuels in the future? On the one hand, biotechnology, but also this power to liquid, power to gas. What we are currently discussing mainly to keep or to allow a system where we can still use the internal combustion engines, turning renewable electricity to hydrogen and then carbonizing this hydrogen to fuels or let's say liquid or gaseous fuels with a high loss of efficiency over the whole chain. We can say that there is the factor 5 between the efficiency of a battery electric solution compared to power to liquid, power to gas, with hydrogen and fuel cells in between. We already had some talks about this. I think there's a clear understanding in California about this, but we also will talk about the question, as in the passenger car sector, that only decarbonizing the truck and the vehicle side will not be the final solution for freight. We also have to see, on the one hand, which is not the topic for today's conference, how to move on the long haul the freight from the road to the rail, but also in urban areas, how to improve the logistical transport systems, which totally go in a different direction with regard to sustainable solutions. If we talk about these fuels, I think one sector we don't have to forget is aviation. We will not talk about this topic too much today, but if we talk about decarbonizing the fuels, then this sector is very much in focus, because other than biofuels, there are hardly any other options than power to liquid, power to gas, or power to liquid at least, to have a drop in fuel, which will allow us to decarbonize the sector today. We are very much looking forward for the sectors I mentioned. What is the overall strategy? What is or can be strategies on transforming our urban transport system at the arrival of the new technologies for shared autonomous electric vehicles? We talk about the question how to increase the e-mobility and learn from the technology-driven situation in California, where electric mobility is already taken up. We talk about the question of how to improve the roadmaps and how to develop a roadmap for decarbonizing heavy-duty truck options. And we're talking about the question of how to integrate the energy and transport system in a way that we can also get the benefits for the two systems, but mainly for climate protection out of it. And the question is if Californian and German cooperation will be fruitful to this. We have a clear opinion on this, otherwise we wouldn't have done this conference. But I'm very happy to discuss this further. And before we get into all these discussions, it's now my real great pleasure and great honor to welcome our cooperation partner at this conference, and Professor Dan Sperling.